OC. I feel like I just saw you earlier today, maybe, for in Fiona's case yesterday, or but it's. I wanted to start off too. Like I'd like to share, as I said, good news, and there was one piece of good news that I hadn't had the opportunity to share. That Eric Turner was named a fellow CPA from CPA Ontario. So Eric, congratulations on that honor. I understand it's a prestigious one. So congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We have a lot of work to do today on LCEs. We're going to actually, assuming that we could, let's assume we're going to approve this project proposal tomorrow along the lines of what we discussed the other day and with a few inputs. And we're going to start our work on the actual issues and developing the standards. And as you know, we've sort of begun an agile approach on this, is that actually we are developing a prototype as we see, and treat it as a prototype. It isn't the last words. We're not getting to an ED today. We're not asking you to approve an ED, but the prototype is there to give you a sense of, are we headed in the right direction? Are there areas that we're missing? Is the tone right? Is the level of detail right? But absent that, we felt we would be a little lost, and we're going to keep on, like most people do with prototypes, bang on it a little bit and see if we could make it better. But it has also benefited from the reference group's input as well. So that is the goal today. Again, we could refer to the actual draft standard itself. It's helpful, but our goal is not to go into huge detail about, is paragraph 71A right or wrong? There will be plenty of time for it. It's directionally, are we getting it right or not? Are we answering the, does it help us to understand the issues outlined in the issues paper? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kai to lead us off and to take us through the issues paper.
Thank you, Tom. And good intro there is that we will now focus on focus on the issues paper and the questions that are in there. But before we go into the questions themselves, I have a few slides that I want to go into. And also, Fiona always has some props on her projects. So for inspiration on this one, I needed to get a helmet. I can see she's getting really happy with the Viking helmet. I'm not intending to wear it through the whole meeting because it's not that comfortable. So we'll be on just for a short while until we get the slides right. But that's inspiration from the Viking, and I got some feedback that they like that you like the Viking on the climbing the mountain. So then here's the helmet, and thanks for the good ideas, Fiona. I think we have the slides up. We see them. You're changing the view, Michelle? Thanks.
I'm sorry, I was trying to change. I'm trying to change the view, but it's not working for me.
It's there now.
Seems to be right now.
It's right now. Yep, it's right now.
All right, there you go.
We have 3 hours almost to go through this today, and then we have a session tomorrow morning on 1.5 hours, and then we will also have a second round at the project proposal tomorrow. If you start here by looking into the first slide that's here, I think I said some of this yesterday as well, or not yesterday, on Monday. Feels like yesterday. There are some things we still need to consider. As I said, name for the standard. Some of the direction we get at this meeting will help us. Again, as Tom said, this is like a straw man. We focused on getting the requirements in, not used the drafting principles yet. We're reminding that we will do that. We will look at the drafting principles for consistency, readability, and understandability. We'll do that for the next meeting. And then also, as we discussed briefly, how to move from the separate standard to the ISOs and support for implementation of the standard. So if you move to the next slide. Thanks, Michelle. Some areas where we need further consideration. Some of those are things that we will discuss today or maybe tomorrow, depending on where we end up. That are in the issues paper with separate questions. Where should the line be on group audits, and also use of surrogate organization, and using an auditor's expert. Those are the specific questions in the issues paper that we will come back to. And then also there are some topics where we need to look further into making them more appropriate for audits of LCEs. What we've taken is the requirements from the ISOs, the core requirements that we mapped up against applicability section, and then we want to adapt them to be more specific to an LCE audit. Some of those areas could be documentation and fraud. Those were areas where we got feedback on the discussion paper where there are pain points as such, so we need to look a bit more at them. And then also around those charged with governance. On IT systems, we have included requirements from the ISOs now, but we need to look into them more to make them more specific and, well, not specific, but more applicable in or appropriate in less complex entities. One example of that could also be that some people always are talking about auditing around the system. Is that something we should allow for or not, and how that could be done? And then also on automated tools and techniques. When we talk about adapting to more appropriate for LCE audits, we're not intending to reduce the requirements, but to make them more appropriate for the circumstances. Lastly, on this slide, public sector considerations. We need to consider if there should be something specific for public sector. I think that could also apply to the applicability section, because the public sector entities, the complexity around them could also be different than in other entities. So if you move to the next slide, thanks. One topic that gathered some interest on, we got some questions on Monday, was around the reference group. When we sent out the revised project proposal, you also got included a cover document explaining a bit around the reference group and including also the names and of who's in that group. On the slide here, we have some of the considerations we had when we gathered the people up for the reference group. We wanted to have a broad geographical coverage, representatives not only being practitioners, but also some others, as you'll see. And we wanted to have representatives from regions where they already have developed or are in the process of developing a solution, and also some stakeholders where we regularly don't have the interaction with some of the intended users for this. As I said on Monday, the reference group has been very helpful. Using the reference group has been very helpful for us. They provide lots of good input. It is though time consuming. On this project, it's been working well. So it's been very appropriate for us, but if it fits for every project or not, I think that's something that we could not sure of yet. So, but it's for us at least, it's been very helpful, even though it's taken a few hours out of our days. It's not meant to replace the working group, but more supplement and test some of the work that we've done. So if you go to the next slide, Michelle, on this slide, then you'll see who we have in that group. Practitioners from around the world, some academics. We have a few methodology providers to see, because they get also input on where the pain points and issues are, national standard setters, and public sector representatives. One group where we don't have anyone represented yet is around the regulatory input. We did reach out to them, but they rather wanted separate discussions than to be part of the reference group. So that is something that we will do between now and March, is to reach out and have the separate discussions with them. You can move to the next slide, Michelle. As I mentioned on Monday, we did have two meetings with CAG. This one was in September, where we discussed some of the approach to developing the separate standard and also the applicability. They provided broad support for both work streams, but also said that we need to have focus on scalability and proportionality on both of them. They also, as others have, the focus on high quality audit. And one section that gathered a lot of discussion at that point as well was around the applicability. So it needs to be clearly set out when it's applicable or not. They had some mixed views about how prescriptive the applicability section should be. And they wanted listed entities to be scoped out and further consideration if that should be expanded. Jim, do you have anything you want to add to the discussion from September?
Thanks, Kai. I think that's consistent with what I heard. Definitely a focus on the scoping that was fairly significant. So thanks.
Thanks. You can then move to the next slide. Then I think we can jump straight into the area and the question that's got the most attention during all our outreach. And I think some of you also alluded to this on our conversation on Monday. So before we go into the details here, I just want to explain a bit what we've done, our process, so where we ended up, where we are right now. I think when we discussed this earlier and when we had the discussion paper, we were trying to define a less complex entity. We found that to be very difficult, maybe even almost impossible. But some of the reasoning behind that is also that it was difficult to capture all the circumstances that made the complexity, and it would end up to have a lot of judgment at the end as well to be able to use it consistently. Then we also got feedback that we wanted more prescriptive scoping. We tried having a more prescriptive long version of the scoping to who's a less complex entity, and then also a shorter one. When we had the shorter applicability section around the less complex entities, we found that it would need a lot of application material, and that would not be helpful at the end. Then we had the discussion in the working group. I think we discussed this many times. We ended up saying that the applicability is really around, it's not really around the entity, it's around the complexity on the audit. The complexity on the audit should drive what's in the standard and not. So when we use the applicability section, it's to give a description of characteristics that has more complexity and are areas where we don't have coverage in the standard. So if you would then use the standard not having when it's not applicable, you could end up in the situation where you would not be able to have sufficient appropriate audit evidence and not be able to reach a reasonable assurance opinion. So if we look at the applicability section that's included in the introduction part of the draft standard that you've seen, it's kind of divided in two parts. One is where something is specifically excluded. We heard throughout that listed should be excluded. even though we had some views that people said listed could be in because there are could also be less complex listed entities. The working group we are thinking is that if you're a listed entity, there are complex areas and where we don't have coverage in the standard, so we think it's not applicable to have that. Then it could also be that law or regulation in your jurisdiction could expand on this to say further areas where it's not applicable. And unlisted, we're also considering, we're following the IAASB discussion on listed versus PIEs, or if it should be a subset of the PIEs. So that's something that could follow. And then we come down to the areas that drive complexity on the audit. In the scoping section, we tried to define areas that drive complexity, and we use this to decide which core requirements to say from the ISAs that we should include. So if you go through this process, and then one further, I think, Michelle. Go through this process and then there is some judgment at the end here around your understanding, but then you need to document your decision if it's applicable or not to use. Then we also included in part 5 a standback, so that if you at a later point in the audit find out that it's no longer applicable to use, you need to have a decision on that, and then you could transition back to the ISAs, which I said is one of the areas we need to look back into. And the green check mark here is to indicate that if you go through this process and you decide it's applicable to use, it's still a choice for the auditor whether you want to use the ISAs or if you want to use the separate standard. So if you go to the next slide, I think then it's time to go to the first question. The first question here, I will only do 1A for now. We want some feedback on the approach we've taken to describe the applicability section here and deciding. So feedback on the approach where we exclude some and then trying to describe what drives the complexity in the audit, and it's around the complexity. So Tom, back to you for the questions.
Thanks, Kai, for the setup here. I'll welcome comments on the approach, just the approach. Kai, away.
Good evening, and thank you very much, Kai. It's for both of us. It's late in the evening, so it's good to have this presentation at the end of the day. You've asked for comments to the first question, little A. I have a comment. I agree that the first issue with respect to scope is the nature of the entity, and that listed entities ought to be excluded. Depending upon the outcome of the IAASB project on the definition of PIEs, the public interest entities, I can foresee that PIEs may also need to be excluded. This applies particularly to banks and insurance companies, which are inherently more complex than many other types of entity due to the nature of the transactions they enter into and the circumstances and events to which they are subject. Furthermore, the applicability requirements of the financial reporting frameworks for banks and insurance companies often involve some of the more complex standards. So think about financial instruments or the approach of expected losses, etc. So the question arises as to whether the parameters for complexity mentioned are the right ones. It is not necessarily the nature of the entity alone that determines complexity, but also the nature of the transaction it enters into and the other circumstances and events to which it is subject. Furthermore, it is the applicable financial framework itself that would be a source of complexity, given the nature of the transactions the entity enters into and the other circumstances in events to which it is subject, not the application of that framework. This is my comment to little a. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kai. Fernando.
Thanks, Tom, and hi, Kai, and thanks a lot for the papers and for the task force for the great work. I'm supportive on the approach. I guess at this point it's really too early to have a final decision. I recognize that there may be some listed entities which could be non-complex, but in reality, I think most of them in practice really have more complexity. Filing the annual report for sure require us to do more work. Probably they have more risks. Usually regulators are also expecting us to get involved in more detail. And the same happens with the regulated entities, as Kai was also saying, banks, financial institutions, recognizing as well that maybe small funds could be pretty simple to audit, no complexity, very few transactions, maybe one or two items on valuation, but nothing major or significant. So I guess it's really difficult to take a firm position on where to go. And I guess the same happens with the group audits. Maybe there are very small groups, easy to audit, but in general, I think the big ones really represent a lot of complexity. So I would support the initial direction, but probably we need to think more in detail whether or not we can open that door to regulated entities, listed, and groups with very specific considerations where are at the early stages and the non-complex standard could be used. However, I think that if we think that those companies will keep growing, eventually they will need to move to full ISAs. So I don't have really any strong suggestion at this point, but definitely the way you're presenting the papers, I think sets the path for us to think going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Isabel.
Sorry, I'm slow to unmute at that time in the day. Really happy to share with you how much I appreciate to see finally, after several years of debates, to see the train leave the station and start the journey of reaching a real-life station for less complex entity and having something to work on. It's really something we encourage from the beginning, and really happy to see the efforts and the outcome. Regarding the scope, really agree to exclude listed entities. I know and I've heard everywhere and in many countries that of course you may have a listed empty shell, but it's not what listed is intended for. So I think by bringing in the listed entities, we would really create confusion for the application of the standard. And I would prefer really to exclude very simple listed entities than to create the confusion over the scope of the audit and let the feeling to the stakeholders that we would be able to audit a complex listed with this standard. Regarding banks and insurance that fall below the PI definition, I'm less worried, because if I understand well the scope of the proposed standard, banks and insurance would be excluded by the criteria of the application of the financial reporting framework. So it would not apply to banks and insurance if it stays as it is drafted right now. But when I look at the scope, I believe we still missed something, or maybe we mixed something altogether, because there's, of course, the nature of the entity that you properly captured, and also the application of the reporting framework that you properly captured. But I think I missed a third one, which is the complexity of the audit. And within the complexity of the audit, I would include, for example, the use of very specialized experts. I would include the use of component auditors, and maybe something around service organization, although a lot of very small entities use service organization for payroll, for example. And I agree that this should not exclude them from the scope. But maybe we mixed in the complexity of, in the nature of the entity, some criteria that do not relate to the entity itself, but relate to the complexity of the audit, such as the use of component auditor that you mentioned in the paper. And I will stay a little more on the concept of group, even if I understand we have a question later in the document, but for me it's really connected to the scope of the standard. And for us, and we rediscussed it in France, it's very clear that we should exclude consolidated financial statements because it's not what it's intended for. So when I say that, it's also connected to the debate we had on ISA 600 this week, and the moving scope that we have currently on if a single entity should apply ISA 600 or not. You may remember that I'm really against this idea that we could consider a standalone entity as a group. And so for me, a standalone entity should be able, if it meets the criteria, to apply the standard for less complex entities. And a group, which is a real group with mother company and subsidiaries, should not be able to apply the standard for less complex entity. I think if we do something differently, it will be very difficult to explain to the stakeholders, even if we could argue that some may see an advantage in using that standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Kai would like to come in.
Thank you, Tom. Just to give a short addition to the discussion around listed and how that could drive the content of the standard. As you know, we have additional requirements for listed entities in the ISO, so that's adding an additional layer, and that's not been included. And also we've excluded some of the other areas as well that are specific for listed. So if we were to include, even though less complex listed entities, we'd have to expand quite a lot in the standard. So that's that's also the same on some of the other areas that we're discussing later on, like group audits, Isabel, that when we've decided on where we end up on the group audits, for example, we need to add some of that into the applicability section. And we haven't done that yet since we've not reached any conclusion on it. So thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Kai. Josephine.
Thank you. Thank you, Kai. Thank you for the Viking hat. That was a nice introduction for the evening for me. Appreciate it. So you won't be surprised to hear from me that on 1A, I continue to believe that there is a difference between the entry points, so when it's applicable, and what the working group need to use when they're judging the requirements against the proportionality test. So when you're going through them and deciding, well, this isn't relevant to an LCE and this isn't relevant to an LCE because of this specific factor. And I think that there's a number of reasons I've expressed previously for this, but one is just literally listening to Isabel. And you know, it's very interesting her explaining the point about groups. And then Isabel also said, you know, and we need to think about complexity of the audit. We're trying to make this easy for people to understand, and yet they've got to go through a long list to determine whether they're in or out of the standard to even start with. So I think the complexity and the complexity list, which I know you want to do with 1C, so I won't go into it, is going to be incredibly burdensome and very difficult to really pinpoint, or not pinpoint, but pin down. Some people want more, some people will be less. And yes, I recognize that at some point we say, that's it, that's our list, and we're moving on. But I'll go back to my point, and I think we have to look to our colleagues in the IAASB who have already been through this process and gone through the pain of the process, and they've come up with what I think is a very achievable applicability threshold, which is public accountability. Because we know as well that regulators or the relevant authority within the jurisdiction, it will be up to them to determine if the standard can be used for certain entities. They're going to amend by size, as you say in your paper, or, you know, as they would do with the pie that comes out of the IAASB project. All that work will be done. So if our starting point is from our accounting standard setters, which is that public accountability piece, and I think that works from an Excel person picking up the standard and saying, this is where I belong. And that will help you a lot with some of the issues that some of your reference group are raising in respect of, well, actually, you may need to think about service organizations. And whether or not I agree with groups being in or not, some are saying that there are groups included in there. So once you have groups included in there, then you've got some tough estimates you might have to think about. Anyway, that's a conversation for later. I'm trying to keep it as brief as possible. So in that regard, I think your applicability should be the same or as close as we can to the IFRS for SMEs. And I think you use your complexity list, including complexity in the audit, which is different from complexity of the entity. They are related, but they are different. And those are the pieces that you use when you determine as a working group, as I say, what is proportionate and what isn't proportionate. And that takes out the complexity for the user picking up the standard and knowing whether they're in or not. And so that's my point on 1A. Thank you.
Josephine, just the point of clarification, though, I get the logic of your argument. There is a little bit of risk to it, though, because IFRS for SME is in and out for consultation at the time, and that applicability question is part of what they're consulting on. Is that my understanding? It could still be a fine principle, but I know it just may mean the target may move.
Yeah, sorry, Tom, I just interject. I understand that, but we'll have that with a lot of things, because we'll have that with our own standards in terms of group audits, where that's going, in terms of audit evidence. We'll always have that, and we have to just, you know, use what the extant says and go from there, from that perspective. I did think about that.
Okay. Sachiko.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you very much, Kaimon. First of all, thank you very much for you and your team's hard work. I was actually surprised when I read the agendas, because it includes a concrete proposal, including draft standard, even if we are now approving project proposal. So I really appreciated you and your team's hard work. And with regard to applicability, I agree that the standard should not be applied to the listed entity audit. But I have some concern on the approach by linking the scope of the nature of the entity and the application of applicable financial reporting framework. But perhaps my concern is coming from the content included in the introduction of agenda item 2B. So I will share my views when we discuss on C later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sachiko. Imran.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much. When I spoke on this topic on Monday, some of my comments got cut off, and really there were just some very important complimentary comments to make that a really enormous respect and appreciation, Kai, for the work that has already been done, particularly supported by the team of Bev and Kalina. It's beyond any expectation of what I had, of what was possible so quickly in the project. So congratulations and thank you. One of the consequences of you doing so much of work so soon is that it's created the opportunity for us now to think through some of the big issues and of course the implications of those issues, which even for somebody who's done a lot of thinking about this, these were not clear or apparent to me earlier on when we spoke about these topics. So thanks for doing that. I will only come back first on what you shared in via email during the course of the week and what you shared in the slides today, and that was the bit about the reference group. A few of us commented on Monday about the value that we take from the reference group, and I appreciate now that you've shared with us where they come from, and I can understand now why their comments are so useful because of the credentials of these people. What would be useful, Kai, as you bring their comments to us in future is I'm unsure really what the difference is between what is characterized in the issues paper as broad support, general support, strong support, etc. of the reference group, and how should the IAASB be considering such votes or such comments, because it seems to be quite a lot of emphasis in the way the paper has been drafted. And while saying that, there's also emphasis in the paper about when one member of the reference group thinks differently, and it seems to be treated in an inconsistent way, as if some negative votes of the reference group members are important and others less so. And as a public member, I'm really confused by this discussion where we say one reference group member didn't agree with the proposal, but the others did. And in other cases, we simply call out a reference group member for not agreeing with it. So I think if we plan to use them in a constructive way, then really the rules of the road around them are going to be important. Otherwise, our arguments are going to be shut down by what the reference group unelected members have said. And as a public member, I'm going to feel very shortchanged by that approach. But getting on to the meat of this evening's conversation, I may be a little bit overlapped between 1A and 1C. I want to say that most of what I'm going to say now, I have sent in comments a few days ago already. But what I should respond to, though, is just the approach to listeds. I think that the approach that the working group has taken is simple. I like the idea that listeds should be excluded from the scope of this paragraph. And I think that any change in that to try to accommodate simple listeds or less complex listeds is really going to hamper the progress of this project. I say this, Kai Morton, from the experience of ISQM2. Always the attention starts with applicability of the standard. And we went on for about 2 years about applicability of the standard before we can progress to other aspects of it. So I encourage you to be patient, but think that the simple approach, and Josephine has given us many examples of why simplicity in this area could be so valuable to us around applicability. Around the detail, though, and particularly answering your question 1A, around the proposed approach on the nature and characteristics, it sounds like, of course, this is still work in progress. But in my view, I think that it is something that we could continue to work through, and it has the possibility that it could work for us. As you refine it further, may I ask you to please consider this? One of the challenges we constantly had in ISQM2 was this argument around consistency. That can the criteria be described in such a way that the scoping is going to work out consistently across firms and across jurisdictions? And Kai Morton, at the moment, I think I say this without doubt of contradiction, that we will have inconsistency of application. I don't think there's any doubt at the moment within firms, across firms and countries. And I suppose that just is an indication of we're working with an elementary list. We're going to continue tightening them down. I think I thought I knew before I read this paper what an LCE was. I'm now a little bit confused between what an LCE is versus what an SMP and SME is. And I think that the use of both of those terms and us bringing those terms back into the paper kind of messes it up a little bit. So maybe you want to watch about how we use those old terms when we as a board had progressed already to the new terminology. A third point, which I only covered briefly on Monday, which is worrying me because you mentioned it again in the introduction this morning, and that is who is responsible for the determination of whether an entity is less complex or not. And what if there is a disagreement between the preparer of those accounts, the auditor of those accounts, and importantly, the person who's going to use the audit report on those accounts? The paper said so. I think the project proposal said so. And again, in today's comments, you said that the auditor makes that determination. I don't think that this approach of determination, where the auditor makes it alone, is consistent with the approach used in practice or in the ISAs, where the user makes the determination or law and regulation make the determination on the type of audit that is to be commissioned. And then there is something which at this stage is really, if it was fatal, this is a really big fatal issue. And that is that amongst these characteristics that we are building to describe an LCE engagement, we are using characteristics of the audit instead of characteristics of the entity. For example, we say, if you use an IT specialist, then this is a complex engagement. You see why I think this is fatally incorrect, Kai Morton, is that the answer to that question, do you use an IT specialist or not, is going to start changing the audit approach, not the other way around. And that would be fatal to audit quality. Can you imagine a practitioner sitting down and making the decision, I could use an IT specialist here, it would be really helpful to the audit, but if I used it, oops, it takes me out of the LC audit space, it takes me into the ISAs. And for that reason, I'm not going to use a specialist on an engagement that really needs a specialist. And I would, there are at least 3 in that list. I think there's no space for any of those items. Otherwise, we will have the opposite effect. It will hurt the ISAs, which I think is one of the issues that we're concerned about in the project proposal, and definitely cause this arbitrage to arise between the ISAs and the LCE standard. And that is one of the risks that we would want to guard around. So that's the overall comments about the approach. I'm sorry they're so lengthy, but of course I've given you a summary of them in writing. Thank you, Kai.
Thanks. Imran, if I'm not wrong, some of your last remarks were very consistent with Josephine's remarks too, about just a different way to start to categorize whether it's applicable or not. Your point about the audit determination alone is a separate sort of point. Yeah, but the question is really, should you're pointing out, like Josephine was, should be more entity specific in terms of defining characteristics, and that the tools that the auditors use to perform the audit should be less of a consideration in making which standard that they're able to use. You know, one of the things I want to sort of maybe get off the table, I haven't really heard much complaint about the exclusion, the specific exclusion. I've heard the possibility that some could see listeds coming in, but the great majority of people have basically said, I get so far, and I don't want to exclude what's going on, that listeds, this is not for listed entities, it's a simple dividing line. And obviously we can't override law and regulation. Am I reading the room properly so far? So it's really a question about how do we say what else is relevant in their approach related to that. I saw Kai sort of, your yellow box coming in, so maybe you want to come in now. We have a few more hands to come up afterwards, but this is a really important point of the project. So Kai? Yeah,
First, I think just a comment on Josephine's suggestion to use public accountability. What we have done, though, is use the scoping to decide what's in and what's out. So we have taken out, so the way we've described, we've scoped out some complex estimates, for example. So if we were to use public accountability as one of the criteria, or as the criteria, if you're scoped in or out, there could be the risk that we don't have any procedures related to what you would need, because you could have a complex estimate without being publicly accountable. So it wouldn't work completely with the way that we've gone so far. And on some of the feedback that we're getting on the audit characteristics as such, I think that's maybe just the way that we've written it so far, because it's an indication that we have not included requirements if you were to use a complex specialist, for example, Imran. So if we describe it another way, it's the characteristics that decide if you're in or out. It shouldn't be if you used it or not, but if the entity is such that there would be a need for that. So we need to describe the background of why you would need to need those procedures, because we've taken out some or not taken in some requirements from the ISAs based on that. I hope that was helpful describing the approach and why we've done the way we've done. So it's kind of describing, trying to describe through the applicability sections what we have procedures for. And then there may be, or for sure, there probably is some wording changes we need to do to describe it in a maybe better way, but that's kind of the approach that we've taken. Thanks.
Len?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Kai, you do need a courage and brave heart of a Viking to take on this project. So based on the comments you heard so far, a lot of respect for all the work of the task force and the staff. So on 1A, I have other specific comments, perhaps related to other questions. But when I was reading this paper, it's very helpful. I'm actually finding it very helpful to read the comments received from the reference group. So when I look at the approach is exactly what we're trying to fix, because throughout the project from the discussion paper, there seems to be focus on less complex entities. And also there's some concern of the small, medium practitioners. Then I read this paper, I actually agree with a couple of reference group members' comments is, actually I'm feeling that maybe the issue is the complexity of the audit. So, but when I go read the introduction paragraph, we're trying to address, seems to be all three of them. So maybe we're trying to fix all three, but it seems to be reading the paper, we're focusing on less complex, the complexity of the audit rather than the entities themselves or the challenges facing the small practitioner. So when I approach 1A, I'm not sure exactly what input I need to give to you, because I think that they could be being three different things. On the listed entities, this is a tough one, because I do talk to a number of securities regulators and stock exchanges, and I think it's, in principle, I think it's right, but there's a lot of dynamics, there's a lot of complexity involved in terms of listed entities. You have to think about from capital formation, talk about barrier of entries. There are a number of jurisdictions out there, including stock exchanges and securities regulators, looking at, if you look at private financing, actually is a lot more than public financing or capital market financing. So having drawn a line listed entity actually may not be the right bright line approach. Another thing is, I know there's a laws and regulations involved, but a number of countries, whether it's in the securities law or in the listing laws, that certain profiles, certain types of entities, they are classified as listed entities, but they do have reduced, ongoing compliance burden. So I just think, when we talk about listed entity, we need to make sure we capture all those factors and considerations. Maybe I'll stop here. I think one other thing I just want to say about the financial reporting framework. I think that's right approach. But what you have in the introduction section, at least from what I'm reading, is still very vague. Need to be more clarity into that. And last thing, I apologize. I did pick up the IFRS for SME this morning because I was reading the paper and I said, well, what did they do at the IFRS Foundation? So I'm taking consideration what Josephine said, also Tom's subsequent remark. I still think that there's some engagement needed, at least drawing their experiences in terms of how they set their entry point into their standards. So with that, I'll turn back to you, Tom.
Thank you. Eric?
Thank you, Tom. And Kai and your group, amazing work to produce the draft standard has really been helpful, I think, to help people kind of begin to see what we're heading towards. And of course, as others have said, it starts to raise more questions than answers in some cases. In terms of the approach, some of the comments that Josephine made resonated with me, and certainly in the outreach that we had done around the applicability and the long list of items, it really is going to be challenging to help people work their way through that and come to the right answers. And so to Imran's point, I think the way it's going at the moment, I just think consistency is going to be very difficult to achieve with the kind of entry point that we're working towards. I'm not sure what the right answer is, but I think that the entry point needs to be as bulletproof as possible, because if there's too much judgment coming into the standard, then there's going to be a lot of difficulty in developing the right standard in the first place because of the variability that might be included. There will be inconsistency in the application of it. Imran's worry about some of the unintended consequences also resonated with me. So I don't know whether this approach is better than the starting with the LCE approach or some other approach. I just think that creating a long list of items to consider is not going to lead us in the direction that we really would like to go in terms of being clear when you're in the standard. Thank you.
Thank you. Fiona?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Mr. Viking, I love the hat. I think that should be a staple for every presentation, so congratulations. I wanted to give my overall support in terms of the direction of the project, and this is consistent with what I said the other day as well. I feel very strongly that we need to have a standard, but we need to narrow the applicability, which is I know what we've all been talking about. At this stage, it's including requirements that in my view aren't relevant, so group audits, user specialists, service organisations, and I think we also need to make sure that it has clear branding as well, which I'm sure we'll come up to also around making it clear that auditors are doing this in accordance with an LCE. Needs to be, I keep saying this, it needs to be a true LCE standard. The way it's currently drafted, I think readers could be forgiven for wondering why would you use ISAs for any audits other than a listed entity, and that's the risk we've got. If you truly scale it down to being more of a true LCE standard, I think there's less chance of us falling into the camp of ISAs are for listed, LCEs for non-listed, which is not where we want to end up. I think the CUSP project is then obviously supposed to focus on those audits that aren't able to use the LCE standard, but they need a scalable approach to the ISAs. So these two are very important side-by-side projects. In terms of the use of an IT specialist, I was struck by Imran's comments, and I'm strongly in the camp that it should be more about the complexity of the entity. So for example, a simple off-the-shelf IT system, rather than whether or not an IT specialist would be chosen by the auditors to actually do the work. And that removes the risk, I think, that Imran described. So considerations at the start that are more, I guess I think of them as sort of statements of fact, as opposed to being left up to the auditor's judgment. So things like, you know, one or a few simple revenue streams, simple IT systems not listed, not part of a group, unless you've confirmed with the group engagement team that it's appropriate to use it. The entity hasn't used specialists, doesn't have complex information, complex estimation processes, and there could be a suggestion that you confirm that in writing with those charged with governance. You know, limited number of users, and if there are external users like a bank, you've confirmed with them. So I think there's a number of ways that we can take out or limit the amount of judgment that an auditor is applying, and you make it very much about the entity itself that is being audited and the complexity. So that's the camp that I sit in. But overall, great amount of work done. I'm very impressed that we've got a draft standard to crawl all over already, which has been fabulous. So thank you very much for all of the hard work, Kai.
It's a reminder that a straw man, it really is a straw man. And so the fact that we can have this discussion is incredible because we have a document out there to respond to. Rich.
Thanks, Tom. And Kai, thanks for your lead in and obviously all the hard work that the working group has put into the papers and getting us to where we are. You know, so first off, I like the idea of linking it to SME, IFRS for SMEs. I'd also say, similar to Eric, clarity is really important. And, you know, when I think about some of these things that we're talking about, the more we leave it open to interpretation or judgment, the worse on consistency we'll get. I very much, back to, sorry. Yeah, when I heard Imran, I started to wonder, wow, wait a second, is that an issue? But you know, both Kai and Fiona, you know, clarified very much that the entity audit approach, audit considerations, and not how we intend to audit is the most important part. But it's a good point to raise, Imran, because we therefore need to make sure that it gets clear as to how we write it to rule out that being a way to go through. Tom, you mentioned, you know, about the IFRS SME standards up for discussion. You know, my recollection in the discussions, though, is it's actually trying to get leaner, not on scope, but leaner on the differences to the main ISAs and focus more on how you disclose. And so I don't think that really would have a big impact unless they just toss it out, which I don't think they're going to do. So I still think it's a good way to start. It gives clarity. You then look at, you know, the considerations we talked about on the entities, audit characteristics, complexity characteristics, and then, you know, listed group, those things that were raised, I think those are not in the standard. So you wouldn't want to use a standard to then audit that. One of the things I worry about, I'm not sure there's much we can do other than what you're suggesting, but I worry about countries, territories going in and just saying, but we like this approach, so we're gonna say use the standard for LCEs where the standard wasn't built for that. I'm not sure how we deal with it other than talk with the NSS and everything, and making it very clear that we don't believe it's appropriate for LCE, for listed or whatever, because we didn't put the requirements in there, but it is a concern of mine.
Rich, on that last point, I think this goes to what Fiona was saying, is why it's so important to have a separate brand for whatever we create. I personally feel strongly about it. We can't control what jurisdictions do, but we can control what's in our language and the IP around it as well. So I think that's keep that in the back of your head as we get to that point at some point in the near future. But I do think that's an argument for very strong separate branding as it relates to this project and standard. Lynn.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Kai and team, for all the papers and for the presentation. I've got 4 comments and an overall comment. I agree with the excluding listeds. I think that gives us a bright line and will lead to consistency and is, in most cases, sensible. There will, of course, be a few exceptions. In terms of the whole ecosystem we talk about in terms of other areas, the accounting framework is important. So at the very least, we shouldn't be inconsistent with what happens there. And I know there'll be some timing issues there. Josephine suggested public accountability. I'm a little concerned about that because most public entities do have public accountability. There's also a large number of them that are less complex. So there would be some subtlety in using those words that would have to be used to make that work in that sector. I'm absolutely with Eric and Imran around complexity. I think the whole essence of what we're doing around defining complexity as far as we can. Currently, the judgment made by my outreach group was that there would be a lot of inconsistency and a lot of judgment. So obviously the inconsistency is based on those different judgments. So the tighter we can get to describing complexity, the better it's going to be in terms of consistency. And Imran said one comment from the reference group, what's the rule? Or sometimes for me, there is a comment that just stops you in your tracks. And one that I heard on this paper stopped me in my tracks. And I think we should overall reflect on it. And that was a potential expectation gap we've got here. And the comment was, I don't see this as a game changer for LCE audits. And I think as we work through this, making sure that what we do in our and users' expectations stay as far as possible in parallel is going to be important. So I just share that because I'm not sure where else I'm going to share it. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Sue.
Thanks. I hadn't put my hand up earlier because I was broadly comfortable with the approach. Some comments on detail, but I think give a couple of the points that have cropped up. I thought it was worth putting on the record. The point about IFRS for SMEs cropped up in some of the outreach I did as well. You know, it is something where there is a track record and there is familiarity with some of those criteria. So I think it would be helpful to look at those. And I think, speaking personally, when I was looking at some of the criteria that have caused the concern about the auditor's approach, I had possibly read that as being shorthand for the complexity of the entity driving the audit response. And it certainly feels from the way that the concern has been expressed that shorthand could be unpicked and therefore the complexity elements can be reflected hopefully satisfactorily. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Sue. Could I get Roger to come in? I don't believe we've heard from you yet.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Look, I'm a member of the working group, but I just wanted to respond to Richard's comment about the fact that national standard setters may set that. If the IAASB gives very clear guidance, gives a very bright line as to who this cannot be used for, then the national standard setters cannot overturn that if they're going to meet their requirements for conformance with ISAs. So as long as this is an ISA, or how we see that. But we need that very clear guidance as to who that can be. So if the board believes that it's not applicable for listeds, we cannot overturn that if we're going to be in conformance with ISAs. So as well as the benefits of the ability, it's very important that we get this right as to the areas where we believe cannot be used, as well as the areas where we believe there may be a judgment call or on the characteristics. But Rich, we cannot overturn something that the board would determine that is in this standard. So I just thought I'd like to clarify that. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, Josephine.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I did want to just come back to Kai Morton's point, because I feel like in some ways I did a disservice to my IAASB colleagues by shorthanding and talking about public accountability. I mean, obviously they have quite a lot of detail on when you're in scope in IFRS SMEs, and that includes by omitting certain topics, which you've also explored in your paper. So they omit insurance contracts, retirement benefit plans, all those areas where you said that you'd be concerned that there would be too much complexity coming into the LCE side. We would be well within our rights to extend that. Say, for example, IFRS SMEs includes business combinations. You know, to Fiona's point, we don't want groups in, then we would omit those as topics as well. So it's you know, going back, talking to them about it, really thinking about the applicability and seeing if that is a starting point, and then omitting along the way. And so sorry to jump in again, but I did feel that I didn't quite explain that point and did potentially give IASB a disservice. Thank you.
Okay. Let me sort of, before I turn it back to Kai and maybe to Bev for clarification, my understanding is that there was some consideration of IFRS for SME and some of the challenges associated with adopting that. But as I read it, again, no real issues in terms of the exclusions proposed. There's a real question about just sort of the approach. And in truth, I guess, it didn't seem fundamental about how you sort of define it. And it did seem to be, when I read it, and with I forget who was talking about it, it really is an entity approach, and some language around the audit elements could improve that understanding a little bit. I think I draw a little bit from Fiona that as you start to narrow, and I do believe actually there's an implicit narrowing here in terms of the amount of entities that would qualify for it. It actually probably will make the standard more simple going forward, because some of the what I read through it later, and I'm sorry to go ahead, is like some of the guidance may not be really that relevant for the types of entities that we're talking about. It just may not be more moot than anything else. But that was my takeaway, is that in general, people got what the task the working group was trying to accomplish here. Obviously, lots of diversity of views about where to draw the line, how to articulate it. Really, most people were embracing that it really should focus on the entity itself, and things should be phrased in that context, but not definitive on where the line should be drawn yet. I don't know, Kai or Bev, if you want to react to some of what you've heard, and maybe some of the IASB points, as well as why that could or could not be a decent reference point in either this requirement or what's in or out, or guidance associated with it.
Thanks. I think Bev is more into IASB than details, and I'm into the details of that, so maybe she could comment on that. Bev, you want to come in on the IASB? No. Oh, sorry. I think you agree with your summary, Tom, that it's we're more or less talking about the same entities, just about how we phrase the discussion and how we phrase it in the scoping document. So, but I think also some questions on consistency. I think that we have what we've done so far is saying that this is an alternative to the ISA. So it's consistent. If you use this standard or the ISAs, I think it would be hard to drive the consistency of the use if it is an alternative, and that's probably the way we should go about it. Because there could be additional layers of scoping done also at the jurisdictional level.
Ev, would you like to come in now? And I saw Billy's hand up. I guess you wanted to come in after Bev, maybe.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, my computer crashed just at that moment, but it came back. I think just on the IASB, we did actually look at what the IASB has got about the public accountability, and the way that we've set this up a little bit is kind of what they have, where you have some very definitive entities that are out, and then you sort of have some others. But in thinking about those others, because of the way that the ISAs work, they cut across the audit, and they're not about individual topics. It's a little bit difficult to have really a list or a list that's usable for this purpose, to be able to really explain what's in the standard. And that's how our list sort of grew. So it's sort of a similar principle. The other thing is the IASB's entry point is not a clean entry point. They have lots and lots of issues around that term of public accountability. And they had lots of discussion now when they were doing their consultation on their SME standard around whether they should actually think about whether that was the right term or not. I think they thought that they would look at the standard first, and then they would see what they got back from that, and then think about whether they do need to actually revisit that or not. We can have a conversation with them to really understand what it is that is problematic about their approach. But it's not a clean entry point. I think whatever we have here, there's always going to be an element of judgment, and there's always going to be an element of people trying to inappropriately use the standard. I think from what I've heard, a lot of the comments that seem to be coming up actually relate to what's in the standard, because all we've really done here is we've tried to describe what the procedures are in the standard. So it may seem like a very long list up front, but what it does is it really helps you to know that if you have something that drives you to complexity, there's no procedures within the standard for you to be able to audit. If we have a much shorter, simpler list, you may not have that up front. So you'd actually have to start the audit using the standard. And that's the point that you may discover that there's nothing in there. So we were just trying to draw that link between describing at the front what the standard is and what's in there, or more importantly, what's not in there, so that auditors then know, well, I know that I have lots of complex accounting estimates. There's no procedures in here for complex accounting estimates. I can't use the standard. So that's sort of the object or the approach that we were using to try and do this. But we will talk to the IASB a little bit more and sort of maybe understand what it is about theirs that is problematic. And then obviously we'll see what we can do to address some of the comments that have come up. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other comments? Willy?
Thank you, Tom. Not much to add to what they've said. Just maybe coming into the discussion around, should we be focusing on the entity or should we be focusing on the audit? What we need to think about is that, a way to think about it is rather than focusing on either the audit or the entity, what we're talking about here is a concept of audit of the financial statements of a less complex entity. And it's that holistic concept. So there is going to be overlap in trying to describe the entity, but also trying to describe what triggers certain things in the audit that makes it complex. You must remember in terms of what Bev has said as well, we're trying to say we are designing a standard that will get you to reasonable assurance if these things are not there. So it is important that we are trying to say that this standard is only appropriate and will only get you to reasonable assurance if you are very sure that certain things are not present. And that is what we're trying to describe. So I think in trying to describe the complexity, there's inevitably going to be a little bit of an overlap between either focusing on things that describe the entity and also things that describe the audit. But I think we knew that this was going to be a very difficult area, and we're probably going to discuss this applicability section right through this whole project. So, but we got very good input. I think we've got very good direction in terms of where we should maybe focusing our attention and trying to get to I think somebody used the term of a tighter description. So we will certainly take that on board.
So, Kai, inevitably when doing 1A, we sort of started to creep into B and C. I don't know how you'd like to handle it, because this seems to be an area, just general, this applicability section, where there's going to be a lot of work still being done on. But I leave it to you to see how you want to deal with B and C.
Yeah, thank you. We did get some comments at least on C, but we need maybe some more, if there are some additional details on C. But on B, as I said, we included a standback. If you, at the start of the audit, decided that it's applicable to use, we have included a standback. You agree that there should be a standback, and is it at the appropriate point after the risk identification and assessment? And then, as I said, I think we started to creep into the discussion on C, on the matters describing and leading to complexity. So if there are any additional points that you have not raised on that yet. I think some in their comments said that they have more details on C that they would like to come back to. So I think on B and C, the standback and matters described leading to complexity.
Okay. Anyone would like to come in? Sachika.
Oh, thank you very much. As I said, I would like to comment on C. I think the matter described as leading to complexity suggested in the draft, for me, it's too detailed. I think it may narrow the applicability of the draft standard too much. For example, under a nature or characteristic of the entity, the first bullet states there are many subsidiaries, divisions, or other components. But it is possible, I think, that LCE has some divisions. And the sixth bullet states oversight responsibility do not rest with one or very few individuals. And eighth bullet states the entity's governance structure is multifaceted, and those charged with governance are separate and independent from those running the entity day to day. But I think it's again possible that LCE has these characteristics. And seventh bullet states there are many individuals involved in role related to financial reporting. But I think it's possible that LCE has some individuals in financial reporting. I know it depends on what the terms such as many or very few exactly mean, but since it's not clear, it seems they are narrowing down the applicability too much. And also under application of applicable financial reporting framework, the second bullet states accounting and reporting by retirement benefit plans. But my understanding is that there are many small entities which have retirement benefit plans, but in some cases, at least For example, in Japan, the applicable reporting framework applicable to them provide the requirements that do not include actuarial calculation. So in this case, I think it is not necessary to scope out audit of LCE from applying the draft standard. And also, under the complexity in the audit may also include when applying the requirement of the applicable financial reporting framework. There are 4 bullets. But I think it's not clear to me how the auditor uses these bullets in determining the applicability. For example, the last bullet states there are limitations in available knowledge and subject judgment that need to be made. Maybe I think it's try to talking about complex estimate, but it seems to suggest that if there are some element of estimation in the preparation of the financial statement, and audit of such LCE should be scoped out from applying the draft standard. But I think there is always some element of estimation in preparation of financial statement. So reading the content of the draft overall, my feeling is that I think what we need to determine is only minimum of basic criteria, and jurisdiction should determine detailed criteria based on their circumstances. I think there is a risk that the current draft will create unnecessary barriers for each jurisdiction to determine appropriate scope depending on its situation. So these are my concerns on the current draft. I also have some very minor editorial comments, so I will send it to you after the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Rich?
Thanks, Tom. So one of the things that I wanted to comment on this was, I think the paper was talking about how to describe the entity and looking at it from the more complex versus the less complex. I think either way is going to be difficult. I mean, we ran into the problem going into the discussion paper as to, how do you describe these things? And I think Kai referred to that early on. But I also don't think trying to go from the, what would make the entity more complex approach. I don't think that's the way to go about it. I think as we've been talking about, clarity and simplicity has to be the way to make this understandable. The whole reason why we're doing the standard is to make it easy, approachable, and so if we're so complex on how to get in, then I think it's going to be a problem. That's why I like the SME, IFRS for SME approach. It's likely, or it's possible to be a little clearer. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, Imran?
Thank you. I have some comments first to kick off on this, the approach of the financial reporting framework. I think that, and there are 4 comments here. The first is that, in my view, and I appreciate that this is how I'm reading this current version of the FRF language, I think that quite a high threshold is being proposed in relation to the financial reporting framework. And therefore, what I'm advocating for would be a much lower threshold. The reason I say this is because on a plain reading of the description of the framework at the moment, it would seem like this description would make most audits into LCE audits. And I didn't know that that was the intention of our board or the intention of this project. In short, what we are saying is that if you belong, we're saying that ISAs therefore will only apply if you belong to one of 3 industries. We list what those 3 industries are, or you're a bank, or you have cryptos. And if you fall into any of those categories, then you will not be an LCE, as these are the only inherently challenging frameworks. And there are 100 examples of why that isn't true. Maybe that was never our intention, but certainly the language leads me there to think about what about construction companies or oil companies or aspiring IPO entities or public sector entities implementing new accounting standards. All of them have got significant complexity in their financial reporting frameworks. And this approach of providing just this short list, Kai Morton, I'm worried that in a few days, that will become the de facto list that you'll find in the front of every LCE file to say, oh, it doesn't fall into one of these categories, therefore it must therefore be an LCE. The last point about the financial reporting framework is that I think in some ways the explanation maybe for the moment is mixing up preparation of the financial statements with the audit of the financial statements. A little bit like the earlier conversation we had about, what's complex? Is the audit complex or is the entity complex? When it says, we actually use the words in my inverted commas, more challenging to audit. If this is indeed both indicators of a complex financial reporting framework, then I think this section is going to need to be considered or for restructuring to clearly delineate them. In respect of your question 1B, I really think that you've hit on a very important problem here, and one that I didn't think was so prominent in our earlier conversation. So thank you for bringing this up so early. But it does generate some fundamental problems in application, at least the solution we have. The problem relates to what happens to the process and the work that the firm has already done in relation to that client and engagement acceptance, as well as the engagement letter. All good and well to have a stand back at that point in the audit, but that audit would have progressed. There would have been money billings on the clock, money captured on the work in progress. Then what happens? The question may lead to some firms determining that they incorrectly took on the audit, as their SOQM was not designed for ISA audits. But will they eventually withdraw? What would be the implication of withdrawing? What would be the implication for fees, for the firm risk, for litigation? I think part of the answer to this question, though, Kai, lies in who makes that original determination. Is it the client, the preparer or the user, or the auditor? And I think that's what may be leading us to this kind of difficult stand back to make auditors do. Other things that flow though from the stand back position is that the engagement partner may have to withdraw, or the engagement team composition may have to change, as those with the knowledge and experience of the ISAs are not brought in. You do realize, Kai, how decisions could be made here that may, in the context of that engagement, just be expedient and not necessarily that which is in the public interest. So they're my comments on the domain of that section. Thank you.
Yes, Imran, I followed you with one sort of question that raised my mind, is on the quantity of the entities that would be covered by an LCE audit. We do know that 80 plus to 95% of this world are SMEs. And so I just worry that in the back of our mind, that the number of whether a clear majority would be in the standard for their audits or not could be problematic, because of those 85 to 95% of all world entities that are SMEs, many of them, the clear majority, are very small entities as well. So I think I got what you were saying in principle, but from like if that the question of the majority goes one way or the other, that could be problematic as well. You understand where I'm tripping up on?
Yeah, sure, Tom. I absolutely get your point. And I guess there's the filter of all SMEs, and then only some of them need to be audited. And amongst those that need to be audited, only in certain jurisdictions in the world do we face this challenge. And from that group, some are going to go the LCE way, others are going to go the ISA way. The question is, at that split, those that go the ISA way, are we only going to have those three categories that are currently described? Because at the moment, an oil company should be within the group of companies that go the ISA way. And the way I'm reading the financial reporting framework description at the moment, it's not going to be that. But maybe that's it will be worked out in the language as this progresses.
Okay. Eric?
Thanks, Tom. And I'm not going to get into the specific details of the individual criteria. I think just to point out that where we struggle with a lot of the applicability criteria was just knowing how is the standard different because of this particular criterion, because knowing that could help with the decision process. You know, if you know that the standard will not be addressing the requirements dealing with complex estimates, then it becomes easier to figure out whether you've got a complex entity or not. And so the biggest struggle for us was just, in going through the list, is it a complete list? What's the impact of the particular factors? Because again, if we're using judgment, we need to know the impact of that judgment on what the requirements will be in the standard. So I heard Bev's earlier comment about the distinction between the IFRS for SMEs and the ISAs and how they hang together. And so I recognize that might be a fairly challenging task to do that reconciliation. But I still think it would be helpful for people to understand where the applicable criteria or common criteria, where the applicability list comes from and how it's affecting the audit standard. Thank you.
I know there's Rich and Josephine are up, but maybe for the sake of preempting, Eric, when you were talking, I saw Bev nodded her head violently, which leads to suggest that in fact, what you were saying was what the working group was trying to achieve, but maybe just failed in their execution. Bev or Kai, do you want to respond to that? And then I'll get to Rich or Josephine.
Yeah, I think it's exactly what we were trying to do, Eric. As you were talking, I was messaging Tom to say that is what we were trying to do. Obviously not a good job, but we are really trying to help people understand or describe those things that are in the standard so that you know when you're in there and you know when you're not. But we've just got to find a way to make the link a little bit stronger. And obviously we've had lots of really good input about specific areas and we need to be a little bit more direct and succinct. I do get the point that it is a very long list, so we've got to find a way of making it more obvious. And I think, as Kai said earlier, this is an area we will continue to discuss. And I think as we develop the standard further, it will again impact the applicability as we move forward. So, but that is exactly what we were trying to do with this. Thanks.
Thank you. Rich.
Thanks, and I do apologize for coming back in, but one of the comments that you and Imran were talking on relating to the population, the 85%, which is obviously, a big number, but understandable. But, I think I've raised this before. Our problem with this scoping is we were trying to get, we're right up against that top level. Those ones at that last 10, 15% of that 85, and whether or not they should be in the LCE standard or whether they should be in the full ISAs. And, you also refer to a vast majority of that number is really small entities. And, I keep looking at, we're trying to do so much for so many different types of entities and stakeholders. And we're going to continue to have this problem if we stay up at that top level. The amount of work we do on it, the discussions on it. So, if we back away from that and still you're going to get a tremendous amount of population being able to use the ISAs, you'd also be able to make a clear cut on that. It concerns me, I think, as Willie and Kai both said, we're going to talk about this. Okay, I won't be talking about it, but you guys are going to be talking about this for many of the meetings to come. I'm not sure how that then fits into how you get it into the standard, and we don't have any application material that would bring all these subtleties out. I understand the essential application material, but this is a big discussion. And will continue to be a big discussion and very important part of the standard. Can you really get that in without having some flavor to it? So I'll leave that to you, Kai.
Josephine.
Thank you. I was going to come in because I felt like to some extent I covered C off already, but I just wanted to give my full support to what Eric had said on a slightly different tangent of that. Notwithstanding, I think there's a lot of judgment that will come from our stakeholders about who should be and who shouldn't be in that list. It's really critical when we are when we are emitting requirements or altering requirements, that we get to that mapping document that says exactly why, not because it doesn't work for an LCE audit. That's not going to tell me that which aspect of an LCE audit. And so to that point, I think I would just want to say that I totally agree with Eric and his concerns around there. Thank you.
Okay, I think Rich highlights one of the toughest things. It's always defining the gray areas are the hardest. This sort of reminds me of our discussion yesterday afternoon about spectrums. Like, and to me, I'm sort of, in terms of spectrums, I'm most concerned about writing this standard for the lower end of the spectrum. But at the end of the day, you get towards a limit, and defining what that limit is will be the hardest part. But at least in my mind, what attracts me, and it doesn't obscure the need to write the standard, is we're really trying to solve the problems of the lower bounds in this case. It's sort of defining where does that end and how you deal with the gray areas, which actually, anytime you have a hard rule-based requirement, which is what it'll be when there's a cutoff, and you have exclusions, is then you sort of have to develop what the principle is for doing it. So it's going to take some art here, Kai. I'm not sure you will have the answer today, but you got a lot of good input on how to think about it. Of course, once we start drafting, if we have a certain part of the spectrum in mind, it may make clarity in the standards themselves easier to come by as well.
Yeah, I think you're right that we probably won't have the answer tonight. We received some good input through the discussion here, so I think we have some good input to work on. I think we responded to most of the comments we got during the discussion, so I'm not sure that we need to come back to any of that.
So I think it may be, I would remind you, when you prototype, and this is what we've done, the iPhone did not look like the iPhone on day one. It probably looked something much different, not to say that we're creating anything as revolutionary as an iPhone here, but it is the issue is when you start to prototype, you will start banging on the ideas, and there's no dumb ideas, and that's really the approach we're taking here. I think it's good time for a break if people are up for one. I'm gonna give you a 15-minute break. So it's 5:38 my time. So we'll reconvene at 5:53, 7 minutes before the hour. Great discussion so far. I think really important input, and I'll see you in 15 minutes. Okay, if we could start regathering. Okay, I think we're gonna start. Kai, I turn it back to you. We have about an hour, 10 minutes. We'll see how far we could get through. And then we'll continue tomorrow morning.
Thank you, Tom. And Michelle, could you turn to the next slide? Thank you. We'll now move to the structure, how we've written the standard. On the slide here, you can see that we've structured the standard towards the flow of the audit, broken into different parts, where part 1, 1A, and part 2 are the ones that are more overarching. Part 1 on some of the concepts that are conceptual issues and general principles that we need throughout the audit. Part 1A being around the quality management requirements of on the engagement, and then part 2 on matters that are relevant on audit evidence that you use throughout the audit as well, and then more following the flow of the audit. I think in the working group we use the term actionable requirements, the requirements that kind of is an action that you need to do on some of those later parts there as well. You can move to the next slide. This is just to show that each part has been structured in the same way with an intro box, objective, and then the requirements. And in the requirements, we have sections that are repeated in each part around the communication requirements and documentation requirements. So grouping together all that's in each part, which is also something, or both the way we structure the standard with different parts and the structure within the standard is something that we received really good feedback from on all our outreach so far. So that's something that's been well taken. And then the essential material within parts, and then appendices that are part of each part. So if we move to the next slide, we will come to the next questions. I think that we can take all of these together as they relate to the flow of the standard and the way it's been structured. So asking for views on how we structure the standard, and if the parts reflect the practical approach, and then on 1A, if that should remain a separate part or if it should be incorporated into each relevant part. We received some different views on that. Both we had some different views both in the working group, but also on the reference group, whether it should be a separate part or incorporated in the relevant parts. And then also the overall structure on the parts, and if there are any other matters that we should consider on the overall structure. So not looking for detailed feedback on the different areas, but focus on the overall flow and structure. We will come back to some more detailed discussions on the content itself. So back to you, Tom.
Okay, this is really on the flow and structure. I was hoping Lynn would come in first, because I remember this was a big point to Lynn when we were discussing this project initially. Lynn.
And I like it. So on 2A, I agree. On 2B, I prefer it to be separate. I think it flows nicely where it is and it fits in with the foundational elements. So I like that. And I also support the structure of each similar part, and I've got nothing else to add. And while I'm here, I agree. I've got nothing else to add to question 3 when we get there. Thank you.
Phew. I was saying, if you didn't like the structure, I would have been, either my memory was haven't failed me or something went really, really wrong. Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I can be brief. I too, I like the flow of the standard. I particularly, probably not surprisingly, like the placement of the audit evidence material early on, as it's pervasive to everything else. So I really like that. I think Part 1A and the separate section on quality management is appropriate. My concern in trying to put it into each part would be that you end up with redundancy or repetition, and that would just lengthen the standard. The overall structure, I think, is good. I would question actually whether the introduction boxes are really necessary. If the objectives are written appropriately and the requirements are simple and easy to follow, I just wonder if the introduction boxes don't actually add to the length of the standard, so if they're really necessary. But otherwise, I think it looks good and fully support it. Thanks.
Thank you. Len.
Hi, Kai. Very supportive of the flow of the standards, and also very supportive of Part 1A, a separate part. I don't think it works into each relevant part. I think the message might get lost. So separate part 1A is the right place, and emphasize the importance of quality management. And everything else looks good. I think great work done for this section. Thank you.
Thank you. Sue.
Thanks, and also very supportive. This got good feedback from practitioners and other outreach. It's a similar kind of structure to what you'll find in a lot of audit manuals and that support methodologies. So very happy with the way it's looking. Thanks.
Great. Isabel?
Yes, so on the flow, I mostly agree. Although Part 1 and 1A are really foundational, so we could expect to have them as a line below the flow and not as the first step of the flow. And I think that's the kind of debate we had on EER with some chapters, so maybe that's why it reminds us something. And also, unanimously, when we prepared, people felt that Part 3 should come first, because that's the acceptance and continuance. However, if we use an electronic tool to enter into the standard, maybe the order is not such an issue, and maybe we don't need to present it with a logical order and a line. I agree to keep Part 1 separate. On the overall structure, it's quite funny, because when I had to prepare an audit manual for the French-speaking countries in Africa, I did it standard by standard because that was the request. But I did an intro box for each standard, whose purpose was what is this all about? And it was not the objective of the standard, it was just for the people reading to know what it is about, the topic. And so I understand that the purpose of this box, this intro box, will be that. And I really agree with that, because I think it gives a lot of clarity to the reader before starting reading a part or a chapter. And I have nothing else. Thank you.
Thank you. Kaiwe.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Also supportive from my side. Kai, I agree with the flow of the draft standard, but believe parts 2 and 3 should be swapped as suggested by the reference group. My answer to little b is I believe that part 1a can be incorporated into each relevant part. My reaction to the overall structure is of each individual part as described in paragraph 31 appears reasonable, and I have no other matters. Thanks.
Thank you. Fernando?
Yep, I also like the flow. The only suggestion is to move a little bit later in the process audit evidence. Agree with part 1A as a separate. I like the overall structure and no other matters to comment now.
Okay, Eric?
Thanks, Tom. Kai, very supportive of the flow, works really well. Agree that part 1A should be maintained as a separate part. Like the overall structure. The only comment I have is on the introductory parts. I think we just need to be cautious that we don't put material in there that implies that the auditor has to take a particular action. It should be just explanatory of the part. And so you might want to just check some of the wording there. And the only other comment I received was in section 7 dealing with the concluding and whether the ordering is appropriate in terms of the logical flow towards the overall conclusion. So that's all I have. It's really good. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. Josephine.
Thank you. Kai, I'm looking right at you because I just want to ask for clarity. You don't want me to mention anything where I think within the parts something should be in another part at this stage. It's just really overall comments. Okay, perfect. In which case I absolutely love the flow of the standard. I always think that it is a one story, a one process, and therefore I'm very, very supportive of that. Similar to what we've done in group audits, I think part 1A to some extent can actually be incorporated into the relevant parts, and you've already done a little bit of that in terms of review, etc. So maybe keep an open mind on that. Having said that, if others really strongly believe it should just sit on its own, it's on its own now, so that's fine as well. I do like the overall structure of each individual part. The other matters, which I think we'll come to at some point, is the question of the application material, but I'll leave that when we touch on that. So yes, very supportive. Thank you.
Thank you. Imran?
Thank you. I'm really supportive of how this looks structure-wise. I think it's beautiful and sensible in its approach. I had a comment to deal with what is being asked in 2D, whether there are any other matters. And here I want to just reference how the standard goes about introducing and using the ISAs. Again, based on what I understand, the standard can only work on a standalone basis. So that when an entity makes the determination that it is in this standard, and with the concurrence of the auditors, it wants to use the standard, it cannot be allowed to say, oh, we have this complex little bit in our business. Let's stay in the LCE standard for everything else, but use that bit of the ISAs. And I think part of how we structure this would make that clear, that you can't pick or choose bits of the ISAs, that this, the standard is self-contained. It has to be taken in full, take it or leave it as it is. But one of the consequences, and I make this point here, Kai, I'm not sure where else to raise it, because it's really a regulatory reaction to references to the ISAs in the LCE standard created for me, and I share this because I don't know how real this will be in the long term. It creates two significant regulatory burdens. And working as a regulator, I thought it was useful to share this with other standard setters and with the board. I may understand this better later, or others may see it differently, and I accept that there may be other perspectives on this. The first regulator perspective is, can regulators who will be reviewing an LCE audit, inspecting an LCE audit, rely on the related ISAs for context to support an inspection finding? Just as we suggest that you may be able to rely on the ISAs to do the audit where it's thin on application material, would a regulator be able to do that if they want to support an inspection finding? And then second regulator perspective is, will the auditors of ISAs who have missed a requirement in the ISAs then point to the LCE standard and say, oh, although I missed the requirement in the ISA audit, following the precedent of the LCE standard, I still achieved reasonable assurance here, and it's no big deal. So I can picture how vast those theses are going to be when firms and practitioners make those arguments. But I thought this is the area where I should be bringing that up today. Thanks, Kai.
Thank you. Rich?
Yeah, so Kai, I like the flow. I think it does work. And, I guess it depends on whether people are going to take out the standard to do their audits, or they're going to have some sort of methodology. But as a read, I think it reads well. With respect to separate section or not, I'm really open on that. The way you have it is probably fine for me. On the structure of the proposed for each part, again, I also think that works. I do have some concerns a little bit on the definitions, how that work, but I'll talk about that in the next section. And just to comment briefly on Imran's comment, no comment on the second part of his regulator concern, but the first part, I really do believe this needs to stand on its own, and not only stand on its own, but look like it stands on its own. So to the extent that we take word for word from the ISAs, that's going to make it harder to make that play that this is a separate just for these, because it's going to be, well, the words are exactly the same. And so, I think it comes in later, so I don't want to talk too much about it, but I do really think we're going to do it separate, make sure they're separate. Thanks.
Good point.
Okay. I don't see any other hands. So I think you should take away, Kai, a lot of support for the flow and structure of the standard. Some caution, a couple of ideas around the structure of each individual part. I think the great majority favored that engagement with quality management should be a separate part. I didn't see anyone strongly in the other camps viewing it faithful, and most people said separate. And as I said, there was some beginning of conversations of what it means to be a standalone standard and its implications in terms of the drafting. I turn it back to you.
Thank you. I think you summarized it well there. Great support from most of the comments we received here. To respond to Imran's comment, though, if you can pick and choose, saying if you're using this, you can pull in requirements from the ISAs, and that we're intending that you should not do, you're either in or you're out. You're either pregnant or not, it's like not half pregnant. So you need, you're in or out. So I think good support, and then we can move on to the next area. We're moving to the next slide, Michelle. Thank you. Then we're moving to some more on the content of on the standard. You see, we used the intro boxes. Some of you already commented on a little bit of this. That's kind of the describing a bit what's in that part. And some of the feedback we got there as well is that that's some of the kind of essential material, something that needs to be described in each of these areas have been put here, which as some of you alluded to, we tried to keep them short, not to make the standard long, but from the feedback we got is that they liked what's there, so that it made it clear what's expected of you. On definitions, we intend not to have a separate definition checksum, as we will use to refer to the same definitions as you have in the ISOs and the other standards. And in electronic, then it could be linked directly. So objectives. Similar, we've started by using the objectives from the ISOs, tried to pull them in. When we did at the first, by combining some of the, let's say, topical ISOs into the flow of the audit, if we were to put all the detailed requirements in from each of them, it became a really long list. Some of them almost became longer than some of the requirements. So we tried to combine them so that it's more generic. And when you're in the LCE area, some of the detailed topic, or some of the combining them, we could also reduce some of the objectives because they're somewhat repeated in some of the topical ISOs. And then, as some of you already say, is still think it's a good read, but we will look back at the drafting guidelines to make it more understandable and usable. And we still need to consider some of the support for implementation, how we deliver that material that needs to be done. There's also an appendix in your document that shows the objectives from the ISOs and how we've combined them into the separate standard. So if you want more details, you could also look at that. So I think then we can move to the next slide, which is then question 3. Views on the proposal regarding the intro boxes, the use of objectives, and also approach to definitions.
Okay. Slide on question 3. Isabel.
Yes, I already commented on the introduction boxes, and I really agree. I agree with what is proposed for the objective, and I strongly agree to keep the same definitions as in the ISAs. Thank you.
Okay, Fiona?
Thank you. Yeah, no objections at all. I strongly agree as well. The definitions need to be the same as the full ISAs, and I think for the most part, the objectives should be the same. And if we decide to one of them's not necessary, then we just keep a record of why that is. But otherwise, I'm very supportive of what you've proposed here.
Okay, Bob?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I agree with Isabel and Fiona that strongly support using the same definitions, just because auditors may be in both sets. That would just be confusing, I think. And I talked about my concern with introduction boxes earlier, and particularly pick up on Eric's point that I think he made about being careful about what those are and how they actually interplay, if they're just explanatory or if they're something more than that, if it's integral to actually doing the audit. I think we need to be careful about that. Otherwise, support what we've done here. Thanks.
Okay. Josephine?
And I'm broadly supportive of the idea of the introductory boxes. You're just starting out, but some of them are slightly inconsistent. Some do have a flavour of what the section's about. Some just basically list contents. So I like the idea of the flavour of what's coming. I agree the objectives remain important. They should be as they are in the ISAs. Admittedly, as others have said, you're going to have some that aren't actually relevant, so that's fine. And yes, the definitions should be in the standard as well. They are part of the text of the ISAs, and you have to, in order to properly apply those requirements, you need those definitions. So they should remain and be as stated in the ISAs. Thank you.
Okay. Kaiue?
Thanks, Tom. Very briefly, to the introduction boxes, which I support. This proposal of the LCE working group and not only the boxes, but also the use of the objectives. I have a comment to the definitions. I'm not in favor of the LCE working group proposal for the definitions. The definitions within the IAASB glossary of terms are non-authoritative. Only the definitions within the ISAs themselves are authoritative for the ISAs. Does this then mean that the reference in the LCE standard to definitions in the IAASB glossary that apply to the LCE standard signifies the definition are non-authoritative? If this is the case, this would make the LCE audit standard significantly less robust, since what the requirements in the standard mean depends upon the definitions of the terms used in those requirements. Consequently, I recommend that the LCE standard either include the definitions within the standard or include a separate LCE glossary of terms that is authoritative for that standard. That's all, thanks.
Thank you. Rich?
Thanks, Tom. It wasn't part of what I was thinking about, but Kaiue's comment that he just made is interesting. And I would suggest, hope that the working group will think about the suggestion and the implications that Kaiue has raised, because it's an interesting thing to think about. You know, when I first looked at this question on definitions, you know, I was uneasy, but then when I looked at the standard, it didn't cause me that much problem. It wasn't jumping out like there'd be an issue, but knowing how much we spend time on to get the definitions right, it does concern me again that they would be outside the standard and you wouldn't have the full background of it that you might have because we're not doing application material. You know, and when you think about, you know, an engagement team and everything that we considered to get into that, you know, there's a lot of information to think about. And so I think we're bringing could be a very difficult issue and a very important, the subtlety is very important on these definitions sometimes. And we might be missing that. So again, I would encourage the working group to think about that. Introduction boxes and objectives, I was fine with the approach. I have some comments later when we get to drafting, but I was fine with that. Thanks.
Okay. Sue?
Thanks. Support the approach here on the boxes and objectives. On the definitions, support the approach and wondered whether digitalization might be a good way of being able to make the definitions far more easily available and accessible without having to move through too many different documents. Thanks.
Len?
Yeah, thank you, Kai. I totally agree on the objective and definitions. On the introduction boxes, I mean, I like the idea of the box, but I'm not sure I like the contents. So it depends on the contents. I think if you look at individual contents, I think I would be very supportive of having that introduction box using the contents in 4 and 5, for example, planning and risk assessment. They actually help me to understand what that section is about. But if you look at the contents in box number 6 or all the evidence, they really don't do anything to me. Those words don't really explain anything. So like the idea to have that box using the contents what you described in 4 and 5, planning section, risk assessment, I think is really helpful. You read the content and help you to understand the whole section. But some of the words in other sections just didn't do anything. So I would encourage you to explore the box, but just look at the content is the most important. Thank you.
Thank you, Len. You got some suggestions here, general support, particularly objectives, definitions. I just, as I think about the definitions, I'm really drawn to the issue that this will be a digital format and not, I guess it's a little bit of semantics about where they reside, but resided it with this separate standard as itself, even if it's the same as it appears anywhere, should it be that hard to do and should be easily navigable? I just, like having definitions outside the standard, I worry about the usability of it. So I'm not sure if that was the intention or not, but in a digital format, it should be pretty easy to link to definition pages without having it separate per se. Page numbers sort of don't matter in that world. Josephine, you raised your hand.
Yes, I just wanted to clarify that that if we do that, then we would have to make sure that it has authority. So my concern is the same as Rich and Kai's. They are relevant to your understanding of the requirements and the objectives. That's why they're in the standards. And so they are, therefore, going forward, they do need to be in the LCE standard. But Sue's point about digitalizing it is a very good one, but we would still have to make sure people understand the authority. So I just wanted to make that point. Thank you. Okay.
Kai, I think you've gotten some feedback, largely positive, in terms of the general direction you guys are heading down. Would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think the only question that was here was around the definitions, and we need to consider more how we can do that in the non-electronic way. But this will be hopefully in an electronic format, and then it's easier to do that. But we need to consider how we should do that in a paper version as well. So thanks for the feedback on this.
Great. Okay. Should we move on?
Yep. So now we're moving more into the requirements and how we've gone about doing that, and then also some parts that are not included at all. I think, as I explained on Monday and earlier today, probably as well, that we've taken what we consider the core requirements from the ISAs based on the applicability description. And you have then also the mapping documents that's been sent out to C and to D to take the requirements from the ISAs and map them to the relevant part of the standard to show how that is done. So this should correspond back to the applicability discussion. As you see, there are a few standards that we've defined, scoped completely out. One of them being use of internal auditors. Reason for that is that if you need to rely on the work of the internal auditor, it's most likely that you're not a less complex entity. We've also scoped out the part from 500 on segment reporting and key audit matters, as that would not be relevant for an LCE audit. So you can move on to the next slide. And then we come to one area that we already got a few comments on, application material. This is an area that we have tried different variations of in the working group. We started out by having pulling out application material that was in the ISAs and had them at the back of each part. It was difficult to decide which part should go in and not. Then we tried different approaches of having a shorter version and a longer version within the standard itself. The feedback that we got from the working group and the reference group was that it just added length, and it was difficult to decide what should go in or not. We ended up, as you've seen, including something what we call the essential material, so things that are really relevant in order to understand the requirements as you go about. So it's more the whys of the application material that we try to pull in some of the essential material. And some of the feedback we also got that we have not worked completely through is that the essential material should follow the requirements. It should not come ahead of it. It should come after. We need to do something on that, and we also have a suggestion that they should not be numbered to distinguish them from the requirements themselves. We have them with a blue background and italics, but not numbering could also help by distinguishing them. We still need to do some more work to exactly define what should go in or not, but it's to give an impression of how this could work. We are trying to limit how much could go in, as we would only be what's viewed as essential. And I think that's what I wanted to go through on the application material. You can then move ahead to the next slide, which is then question number 4. I think first we can take 4A and 4B together. 4A being the views on the working group approach of including core requirements, and then also B on the views for ISAs that are not addressed within the draft.
Okay. So we're just going to do 4A and 4B here.
Yeah, 4A and 4B first.
Yeah, maybe so people could figure out why 7 follows 4 next. Kai Uwe.
Thanks, Tom. Kai, very briefly, broadly agree with the approach of including core requirements within the standard. And I also agree with those standards and products, therefore not addressed within the draft standard. Thanks very much, Kai.
Isabel.
Yes, I agree with including the core requirements in the standard. I was happy to see in paragraph 45 of the paper of agenda item 2 some drafting principles that look really nice and that are quite similar to the principles that we're working on with the CUSP subgroup. However, I believe that at this stage we should try to keep the same wording as much as possible as the one that is in the ISA, because if not, people will be really confused. And even if sometimes it's very complex the way we drafted it in the ISA, if we change the wording of some requirements, I believe people will be really lost when it deals with the same requirement. To question 4B, I agree with what has been done. 501 segment information. It's not the standard I read every day. it seems even quite obsolete. I think we could have developed ISA on many other balance sheet P&L or disclosure item. And at the time when we are able to perform assurance engagement on integrated reports and non-financial information, it's quite strange that we still have a standard on segment information. I think it was very new at the time it was developed, but now it's just business as usual to audit that. ISA 610, I read in the paper that some people object that sometimes LCE have an internal audit function. Based on my experience in that kind of entities, even if they have some people that they call internal auditors, often they don't qualify for the definition of an internal audit function as we have it in 610. So I'm fine with excluding it. And 701, as it applies only to listed, it's obvious that for me it has to be excluded. Thank you.
Okay, Josephine.
Thank you. So on 4A, I think, Kai, you asked us a question on, I don't remember what day it was now, Monday, Tuesday, about the approach to the requirements. I do think it's important at this stage, rather like Isabel's point, that we just stick to what we have in the ISAs to start with. And then we work with the CUSP team to decide where those requirements can be improved for understandability. And that would also apply to where we've made adaptations as well to bring in requirements from other standards because they fit better, like for example the risk assessment piece as well. 4B, I'm not sure I can answer that yet because I still don't believe we've actually pinned down our scope, but to the extent that you have excluded internal audit, and that's fine. And then on essential material, I think what's essential about this is whether we are going to move down the path of the individuals being familiar with the ISAs or not familiar. And until we've decided that, I don't think I can answer this question either, because if they're not familiar, then I think we need application material, because application material will tell you the why. And if you're not familiar with the ISAs, you won't understand the why behind the requirements. So, but essential material, I'm fine with it as a concept, but we need to pin down that other piece, unfortunately, first. So it's a little bit cart before the horse. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to hold off on other comments at 7 until we finish 4A and 4B. But just we will remember that you said that.
Sorry.
Fernanda.
Thanks, Tom. I just want to express my support to letters A and B based on the content of the issues paper that we have as of today. Thanks.
Okay. Len.
Thank you. Kai, 4A, I'm fine, support the approach. 4B is more of a question. I know you listed those standards, but particularly on 701. So you might, I know in ISA 701 only applies to listed entities, but in some jurisdictions that the user of the audited financial statement might find key audit matter useful. So let's say in the terms of engagement, let's say the user would like to have that section, key audit matters, in the auditor's report. So how do we deal with that? It's a very simple, less complex entity, but the report, people calling for key audit matters. So does that mean when people like to see key audit matters, the entire less complex entity standards don't apply anymore? Or is it going to be, it's okay to use less complex entity standards plus 701? So wasn't very clear to me, or maybe that's probably dealing with additional implementation material. I don't know, but 701 is tough because the information usefulness sometimes is requested by the user. So it's more of a practical questions I have. Thank you.
Okay. Lynn.
I agree with 4A on the core requirements. On 4B, I am not sure at this point in time. And I particularly have the same question as the reference group. The first dot point is I question whether if one of these does apply, can a person move from the LCE standard back into the ISAs for guidance? Because I think naturally you would. And being on the board in an audit committee of what I would define as a less complex entity, but we do have internal auditors, they're shared with a bigger organisation and they would fall within 610. I am just a bit, there's an open question for me whether removing 610 is correct. And I'm certainly interested in the answer to the first dot point in the green box. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Rich?
Thanks, Tom. Not surprising from my previous comment, I guess I would have to put myself in the box that I guess I don't agree with 4A. And again, to me, it's the confusion that arises. Sorry, it's late and I'm starting to slur. That arises when we take certain ones from ISAs and then other ones we adapt, and so it's some sort of a hybrid, and then it gets to the point that actually Lynn just raised of, well, on some of these, I'm going to look to the ISAs for an understanding, but with that understanding then comes with well, how will others look at that? And again, to Imran's point earlier about regulators, well, they go, well, you should have looked up if you didn't understand this and follow what the ISA said on this. I get this comes to the heart of the point of what our stakeholders that are asking us to do this want. And I wonder whether it is not a cut and paste, but actually a standard that's easily readable and gets to the point of a small audit. And again, the reason why we're at where we're at is because we're in that gray zone and everything else below it works. But because we're trying to make things possible for those big LCEs that aren't listed and stuff, we're getting into this unclarity in my point of view. I do have some positives. So I do like the concept of one thought per paragraph. I think that does make it easier to read and to understand. And the preliminary decisions on the inclusion and non-inclusion, I fully in line with that. I still think there's movement going forward on other areas, but what you've covered, I agree with. Thanks.
Okay, that's the last of the hand. Kai or Bev, I call on you to, I think that in general there was consistency here, but one or two divergent viewpoints.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's a great support for the approach that was taken with a few conditions on that. On 701, we need to think more about that, how that can be done, or if it can be done, if you can pull it in. I think our intention, or as we described earlier, you're either in or you're out of the standard. So you can't pick and choose to get requirements back in. 701 is somewhat different though, as it is a reporting standard. So we need to consider that one a bit more. On 610, what we try to do is not exclude entities that have an internal audit function, but where you have to rely on the work of the internal auditor in order to reach a reasonable assurance. So because otherwise we'll have to include the requirements from the 610 standard as well within the separate standard. And I think also some of the feedback we got there were a few people that said that they wanted to be included because they thought we were scoping out internal auditors completely. But they liked because I think, as you said, Rich, on some other areas, I think the less complex entities that have an internal audit function is probably one of the gray areas, and a few entities compared to the total mass here. So then I think we can move on to question 7, the approach to essential material.
Okay. Bev, do you want to come in? I think we had to quickly exchange it. Really need one piece of clarity on an issue.
Just 2 things quickly. The one is there's always the ability to do, like we do today, is ISA pluses. So there's lots of jurisdictions around the world where they've got the ISAs and they add things on. So maybe some of these areas like 701, if a jurisdiction feels strongly, they could always sort of add it on. You're not taking away from then getting the reasonable assurance opinion in the same way, but we can think a little bit more about that. And then I think the other, we may come back to it. I think it's really important that we get clarity around whether we stick to the wording of the ISAs or whether we can veer off. I think some of the other questions as we go through, we may get a little bit more clarity, but at the end of tomorrow, before we finish, I think we may need to have that conversation again, because I do hear mixed views where people are looking for us to make it more sort of appropriate for LCEs, which is going to then involve a change in the ISA wording, whereas a couple of you had noted now that perhaps we should stick to the ISA wording so that people understand what it is that they're doing. We are trying to sort of make the break between the ISAs, and so I know that we keep going back to, we can refer to the ISAs, and but I think we need to see this as a standalone standard, that people need to be able to read it on its own. And going forward with time, there may be people that only use the standard. They don't know the ISAs, so they don't know that they can go and get things there. And we obviously, this is still very early stages of this, so we need to think more about that. But we are trying to make this standalone and sort of break that umbilical cord a little bit for those that perhaps don't use the ISAs. There's lots of jurisdictions that don't use the ISAs yet. I had some questions actually the other day from the Maldives who are thinking about using the ISAs and sort of how they can start to use the ISAs. And I thought, well, this standard would actually be particularly helpful for them in the start to sort of make, sort of get an introduction to what's in the ISAs. So for people that haven't ever used the ISAs, then it still needs to be standalone. Obviously, those that use the ISAs, it's helpful because you've got some of the background information. But we will think more about some of these aspects. Thanks.
Okay. Any reaction to Bev? Okay. It's important for us just to keep that in the back.
Did I hear Bev look? Bev is looking for volunteers to go to the Maldives to explain to them how to use the ISAs. Is that what she asked for?
Are you volunteering?
You count me in, Bev.
You may geographically be the closest. So, Fiona?
I'm happy to volunteer. I'm troubled a little bit by this this concept of, I guess, moving away or breaking the connection with the ISAs. And I mean, to me, maybe it's more about the CUSP project helping the Maldives understand the basics of what's in the standards and how they apply them in a scalable way. Or maybe it's a documentation guide, and maybe that's what places like the Maldives really need. If they're going to apply the ISAs, here's how you do it in a simplified, streamlined way. Because what I often hear for these jurisdictions where, you know, maybe they're not used to using the full ISAs, for example, is it all comes down to documentation. There's this there's a view that there's this, you know, burden of documentation when it comes to ISAs because it's got all the bells and whistles. And I think that the documentation can be streamlined. So maybe it is a documentation guide or some other way that we can help places like the Maldives. But I do feel a little anxious about the comment that was just made around, you know, sort of breaking the connection with the ISAs for some of these jurisdictions. That troubles me a little bit. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe it's late in the conversation. I'm not sure that was the intent. The intent, I thought, was more to say that there may be deviations in the LCE standard from from the direct text in the ISAs more than anything else. I'm interpreting now Bev's language, but do I have that right?
Yes, I think the intention is not to start sort of leaving things out of the standard. We've brought in what we need, but it's taking what we have there now and then making it more appropriate in some cases. Documentation is one area, Fiona, that we do need to look at, and because we know that it's a pain point. So we wouldn't reduce the what an auditor would have to do under the ISAs. You would still have to document the same things, but maybe just there may be more. And fraud, the way that in an LCE, fraud is looked at slightly differently. The fraud is fraud, but perhaps some of the things that are available to the auditor are slightly different in an LCE, and so just maybe making some changes to the requirements as they set out in 240, what we've brought across, maybe just wording those in a different way. So I think we've obviously got to be careful how we do that, because obviously we've said that you can get to the reasonable assurance opinion because we've still got all of these requirements. So we can't start reducing those requirements, because otherwise you're going to question how you get to your reasonable assurance opinion. So just some more thoughts around that. But I think the point really is do we start making some of those changes and moving away from the wording of the ISAs? And that's what I was trying to get at. Not that we want to have a completely different thing, because I think we heard loud and clear from the responses to the discussion paper that our stakeholders are not looking for something completely different, but they're looking for something more usable that will make it easier for them to audit LCEs.
Does that make you more comfortable, Fiona? Okay, we will not seek your full answer then, if the way, but okay, I think we could get, if you're uncomfortable, Bev, were you seeking anything more on that now, or will it come out as part of other questions going forward? I thought so. Okay, we have question 7 here. We're clearly, our math skills are improving over time, that we're jumping from 4 to 7, but 7's a lucky number in lots of cultures, so let's go with it. Guy, you want to introduce 7 at all?
Yeah, I think I did briefly before, but I think my head is beginning to be a bit tired. But do you want to have views on the approach on the essential material, not the detailed comments on what's in there? I think we got someone started to commenting on it already, but the approach to having the essential material. So the views from the board on that.
That was Josephine who jumped the gun, but we've now remember what you say, Josephine, in context of this discussion. By the way, this will probably be our last topic for this evening, and then we'll renew again tomorrow morning. Bob?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And actually, I'm glad we can remember what Josephine said, because my thoughts are very similar. It's a little bit difficult to tell until we settle on whether a familiarity and background with the ISAs is appropriate, or whether this is to be completely a standalone thing. We do have concerns with in Kai, not specifically with what we've got in now for essential material, but really questioning more generally for auditors who may not do audits every day, and if they're not familiar with the ISAs themselves, is it feasible to be able to include enough essential material to permit an audit to be done what we would expect to be? So I think, until we get our arms around that, it's difficult to answer, but concerned about whether the essential material would really be enough to ensure that a quality audit is done absent familiarity or background or experience with the ISAs themselves. Thanks.
Okay. Bob, thank you, Bob. Isabel?
Yes, the feedback we had is, of course, keep it short, less is more. Often when a country develops a standalone standard for small entities, or then the question is, how many pages is it? before asking what is in the standard. So there's a competition. So we are very proud that we have a 20-page standard, but someone has a 50-page. Point we need.
Lost the audio.
Ah.
So we got to the 50-page.
Yeah, yes. So I was saying that some have a 20-page and some have 50, and 50 is seen as being not as good as 20. But I agree that it's impossible to have only requirements. At some point, there's a need of some more explanation. But the challenge would be to keep it as short as possible. And the thinking we will need to have whenever we want to include some paragraph of application is to think if the right place is in the standard or in an implementation guidance. Because the people I spoke to said that they don't really need this application material that is supposed to provide example, but not as useful as they would like. And they need, in addition to that, some implementation guidance. And a lot of people mentioned the SMP guide. So maybe we have to think if part of what we would like to include could be better placed in another publication from the IAASB or from anyone else, maybe SMP, but something more practical with templates. That's what the people ask for, more than pages of application material that keeps really theoretical. Thank you.
Thank you. Kaiue?
Thanks, Tom. My view is that the application material may be particularly important when it reflects so-called negative requirements. For example, clarification as to what the requirements do not require. The working group should seek out such negative requirements in the application material and consider them from inclusion as essential material. In my view, considerations could also be given to use a tabular approach. That means the requirements on the left side of the page with the accompanying application material on the right side of the page. This would at least have the appearance of reducing length and would give the working group greater flexibility on the volume of the application material. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you. Fiona?
I just wanted to say that I agreed with Josephine and also with Bob. I had some concerns, and it is a very difficult question to answer as well, given the stage that we're at in the project. And then just minor things, I was, a little perplexed as to, why the essential material, for example, would come before a requirement, and then I got myself a bit confused by all of that. So, so I think there needs to be some more thinking around this. But generally speaking, the issues that both Josephine and Bob articulated is how I feel as well. So thank you.
Eric?
Yeah, if you can just replay Fiona's tape, that would work for me. Yeah, just struggling with the how much more is needed and where it resides and what it looks like. With respect to the maybe some detailed points, quite liked the reference group suggestion that is, if we keep the essential material, that we look to see whether that can help with some of the challenges that were identified in the discussion paper on the application of requirements for LCEs. And we will need, of course, some consistency in how we decide on how much essential material is used. And as with the introductory box, we just need to be careful also as to whether there's actions for the auditor to take included in essential material. Hopefully that shouldn't be the case. That's really all I would like to say at this point. Thank you.
Rich?
Won't repeat what Bob, Josephine, and Fiona said. I agree with that concept. We need to get that worked out before we can really comment on this. I also liked Kaiwa's tabular format, because I go back to when we get the standards to, the first and second draft and we're reading them. I find it so much easier having the application material right next to the requirement. We are trying to find what could make this easier for LCE auditors. That might be a way. It's a different way of getting the material. It also might make it easier then to include some more of the application material that helps the why. And we spend so much time on that in the ISAs. Why do we think the auditors here won't need that? I mean, a lot of the stuff we hear about, on from IFER and regulators, is that people, are failing on the execution of audits. Well, I mean, part of that is, do they understand what they need and why they need it? I understand these are meant to be simple audits. They're still audits. And so we need to give them, some sort of help on that. Conceptually, I'm okay with the essential material, but the question is, how much do you put there? Thanks.
From Len.
Thank you, Tom. Similar comments to Josephine, Bob, and Fiona. I think those materials important. It almost seems like the project has two competing objectives: length of the standards, but also scalability. But I do think over the years, when we develop a lot of good material, that should be part of the standards. I wonder, in addition to what Kai-Wu said about the tabular format, maybe technology can resolve that. Somebody's mentioned about using implementation guidance. I'm actually not supportive of implementation guidance, because over time people lose sight of implementation guidance, and I think some of those essential material needs to be have a place, whether it's through technology, tabular format, but it's important to have them together. Thank you.
Lynn.
I agree with all the previous speakers in terms of caution here. The trick is going to be to balance content and length and usefulness. And I thought it might be useful if the task force have some criteria for what actually goes in the essential material. And in paragraph 69, I particularly liked the essential material being used for the explanation of why, but I was less comfortable with a focus on concepts. So just some framing comments from me. Thank you.
Okay. Fernando.
Thanks, Tom. I also agree with comments from others. This is a very difficult question to answer, and especially for this group. I think all of us have been involved and working with ISAs for at least the last 20 years. So reading a requirement without application material or essential material, it just clicks for us. In our mind, yeah, we understand what we need to do, why it's important, how to do it. So we don't really have an issue. And most of the practitioners today, they don't really have an issue. And that's why it's pretty easy to have a 60 or 70 pages standalone document and really go and do the audits for LCE. But going forward as years pass, I think rotation, changes in people, there's a risk to really lose some knowledge, and maybe years from now, we are just passing the problem to the firms because they will need to develop some kind of methodology, which is really application material or essential material to really supplement the 80 pages standalone document. So I think it's too hard really at this point for all of us to come up with a simpler and single answer because we don't really know what's going to happen going forward, and we need to consider also that topic in mind. We need to keep that topic in mind. Thanks.
Okay, that's the last of the hands. Let me sort of hear what my reaction to what I've heard. So yeah, I understand it's hard to make a decision on 7, and I don't think we have a hard firm rule yet. Partly it depends upon what's in, what's out in terms of applicability of the standard. I would strongly caution, though, on bringing too much application material into anything we do here, because there will be no stop to it, and we will find ourselves with ISAs rebuilt, which sort of defeats the purpose. So I get the conceptual argument in my mind, but I also just set note of caution is like if we could develop, sort of understand who the standard's for, understand some criteria for whatever we call it, essential material, guys, like, and it's hard to see it yet. And then understand that there's got to be a bunch of educational material being prepared around this. If you know, so people talk about IFRS for SMEs, there is a lot of guidance and stuff developed around that, both by the IAASB, IFRS Foundation, and others. But if we load it into the standards, we may defeat the purpose of what we've set out to do here. So it's just a caution. I don't fundamentally disagree with anyone yet, but I think right now we're at the point is it's really hard to make a hard and fast rule as it relates to 7. So ask for the views. Is there's concern about committing to this yet? Is that my read? Concerned because we haven't defined really who the standard's targeted for, and what the criteria for determining it. Some concern that people may need that material. And then my balance by my concern is we could be going down, opening a real Pandora's box here and undermining our efforts. That's my take, my opinion on this topic. I just remind people what we're trying to strategically create here too. So I turn it back to Kai now, and if he wants to call on staff too, please do feel free to do so.
Thank you, Tom. I think you did a good summary there of what was said. And there is caution. I think we all agree on that and how we can move forward. But we also, as you said, can't stop just copying everything from the ISAs, as it will be really hard to define what should go in and what should go out. And that's why we have the essential material to be the wise that you would need in order to perform the requirements. Also remind that on some of the previous slides we had that we still need to consider some of the material that would need to go with the implementation, and maybe there also could be work being done with national standard setters, and Isabel also referred to the IFAC SMPC guide. That's also something that could potentially support some of what we're doing here. Also think that we will come back to some of this because some of the questions that we have for tomorrow, standalone versus link back to the ISAs, is touching on the same thing, and so we are on the same topic again, but then maybe doing more of a decision tomorrow.
Okay, I think this is a good place to pause. I thank everyone for sticking with us for a long day. I know some of you want to get some sleep, so please go do it. I need to celebrate Hanukkah too for my kids, so I'm off to do that. And for those who just started the day, have a great start of the day and rest of the day, and we'll catch you tomorrow morning, our time. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye
Bye.
tomorrow.